Hello. Hi. If you're here at this time, you were probably here at the same time last week, where we had a slightly aborted start to our second session. So I'm happy to say that we've managed to upload everything, get everything kind of ready to go. So we'll be hearing that talk from Eric in a bit. My name's Dr. Carl Fraser. I'll be the host for for this session. And I'll bring Zoe and Eric in a minute. But first, I might just very briefly explain kind of what we're doing, just in case you missed it from last time or the first session. So today we're going to continue the chain reaction thread, where the interviewer from the last time delivers the presentation this time. So in a minute, we're going to have a presentation from Dr. Eric Liebeck, followed by an interview of Eric, led by Dr. Zoe Boltatis. So before that, for continuity, we'll have a quick review of the really great presentation we had from Professor Chris Newfield, Director of the Independent Social Research Foundation, where if you joined us on that session, he discussed these four alternative futures for the university. And that I think that was it's now 3 weeks ago. So you'll be able to find that on our platform. We'll bring up a little link at some point. Now is the point. So yeah, you'll be able to find that there. But maybe without further ado, further waffling, I'll bring in Eric and Zoe. She's there.
Hello.
How are you?
Hi, and there's Zoe.
Hi.
And I see a special guest has also joined us in the background, but we'll leave that perhaps as a surprise for everyone.
Cool. So yeah, I guess we should talk a little bit about Chris's presentation before we go straight into yours.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, maybe you can frame it a little bit better for us. I mean, these four alternative futures for the university, how they might be pursued, how some should be pursued.
Sure. Well, I was really struck by Chris's presentation in terms of the way the four different possibilities. Even just the first step feels very utopian, but less utopian than it would have done maybe even 4 years ago, which is cancellation of all student debt. I mean, that was inconceivable a few years ago, but that's, on the table. At least some amount is of cancellation, and at some point something needs to be done, because at this point it's about $1.9 trillion, I think, of debt in the U.S. And I think at some point during the course of our discussions we can talk about all of the knock-on effects of that, because you have a whole younger generation that's incapable of saving, renting instead of buying. Maybe that's a good thing, but society's going to have to change. But that's just one example of how changes in the university and the way they're funded have this huge social kind of effect. And that's really what is behind my research in general, which is looking at the past 200 or more years of universities. And just starting, I have a book that's just come out now with Routledge called The University Revolution. And it just starts with a really simple question of, like, people didn't used to go to university, and now so many people do, about 50% of the population. And just like, why does that happen? And all of those historical reasons are still embedded with what we do today. So if we're going to go forward, we need to start by sort of looking at what happened in the past, I suppose.
Yeah, I think that's where the link between yours and Chris's thoughts is strongest. So I guess you ready for the Q&A session?
Sure. So I can. This is an odd. One of the reasons that everything went wrong last time was I was producing, rendering, streaming, and this. I said to Zoe and Carl, I restarted my computer, fresh slate, probably the first time in months, but. So it should be ready to go. We'll see how it works, but we could start that more or less when you're ready.
Okay, well, maybe what I'll do is I'll do a more formal introduction and
Oh,
then
okay, okay,
start the video and then we'll see the thing afterwards, what more views over. But yeah.
okay, great.
Cool. So, so Eric is working in the emerging field of critical university studies. Libec's work draws on processual and civic approaches to social knowledge and practices to make new connections between disciplines of sociology and education. His doctoral research at Cambridge explored the history of the social and legal sciences during the late 19th century, transfer of university models from Germany to. He is currently editor-in-chief of the Journal of Civic Sociology, published by University of California. So that's what I do.
Okay. In 2016, in response to the Trump and Brexit votes, my colleagues and I founded an open access journal called Civic Sociology to bring better sociological knowledge in contact with reality, including the widening political, economic, and cultural gulfs between educated and non-educated populations and regions in advanced industrialized nations. We realized we were similar yet different from public sociology as articulated by Michael Burawoy in 2005, rather than separating a critical applied branch from a more professional detached research. We aimed to integrate all four forms of sociological knowledge and practice through the solving of social problems with local communities. In this lecture, I will work through my thinking on the particular problems facing universities today, including the withdrawal of local engagement identified by the UPP Foundation in 2019. We will begin with my theory of the academization process, or university revolution, in particular with the core paradox or contradiction we find ourselves in at this moment in history. The first phase of the academization process ended after the turn of the 20th century, having begun at the end of the Napoleonic Wars in Germany a century earlier. 5 factors caused this transition from medieval to modern elite universities, including class conflict, especially among the middle and upper classes, the displacement of religion, imperialism, particularly intra-imperial competition, and fear of German ascendance, also the changing roles of women and children in society, and lastly, growth of science and technology, including both industrial engineering and philanthropic public health, medical science, and so forth. All of these together led to the repositioning of universities as a central institution in the making of modernity. The emergence of a new class of academics and professionals, what I call the university revolution, gave this class a particular ideology, an anti-elitist elitism. In this communicative system, schooled individuals ground their self-interests in external objective claims while criticizing other elites using the language of our science contrasted against their ideology. This produces a kind of auto-critique, particularly amongst progressive professionals who tie themselves into psychic knots to retain their denial of self-interest while constantly pursuing high-status positions, wealth, and esteem. It's not difficult for humans with eyes to see through these masks, providing ample fuel for less scrupulous politicians and ideologues on the right to shout, "Hypocrisy!" to wide applause. The university becomes a central referent in these ideological conflicts and accordingly becomes the central institution in the global organization of modern ideological power, paradoxically organized around the critique of ideology on both sides. By the mid-20th century, the new class elite of academics, professionals, and civil servants settled around 3 key interests. 1, an economic interest in capitalizing on credentials through higher salaries. 2, a political interest in controlling the conditions of one's own work. And 3, a cultural interest in participating in critical discourse, that is, abstract, knowledge-based, cultural, and linguistic community. There are variations. Consultants might prefer high salaries, while academics might trade pay for cultural esteem. But in general, these 3 interests are characteristic of the new class that starts to consolidate its position in society at the end of the 19th century. Once the link between educational credentials and future social position and income was established, we see a sustained expansion of education and opportunity for individuals, which substitutes for further extension of actual economic, political, or cultural power to these historically excluded groups. So first, middle-class men and women enter elite universities, then working-class men, then minority ethnic populations, until now we see over 50% of the young age cohort in tertiary education. Yet this does not increase social equality. The expansion of a contradictory university system only reinforces inequality, precarity, and inflation. Not simply grade inflation, but actual inflation when debt, uneven salary growth, and financialization proceed unchecked. The result is generational, regional, and class inequities that will take decades to unravel. We need to start undoing and reconstructing universities and societies now. So in his talk last month, Chris Newfield highlighted the dual role of universities as a force for both good and ill, which we need to both protect and reform. We are in fact at an inflection point between the second phase and a new third era in the long history of the academization process, a university's 3.0, if you will. So why this interregnum? The core paradox of a massifying university system set up for elites in the 19th century has hit its limits now that 50% of the population is told that they are both elite and not at all special. Such a logic only makes sense in an expanding division of labor, wherein increasing specialization of functions means new graduates find vacant structural holes. Perhaps in some places this functional integration works better than others. German, Scandinavian, maybe Japanese welfare economies come to mind here. But outside of these corporatist states, particularly in English-speaking countries, more and more graduates embody the philosophical fiction that knowledge is a consumer product. And agencies filled with such schooled individuals accredit themselves with certificates and rankings to prove that their knowledge is world-leading, while simultaneously denying the possibility that others might know more than they do on matters of common sense, right and wrong, justified versus unjustified authority, or any other matter of genuine substance. For instance, the climate science necessary to stop the world bursting into flames. The dramatic second phase expansion of the social fund of knowledge therefore hits its limits when channeled through the training and graduation of individuals who then go into job roles that are no longer expanding. This produces a severe disconnect between promises made and actual reality, wherein an overheated job market produces precarity in every direction. Alvin Gouldner called this condition block descendants, which could lead to the radicalization of younger generations who generalize their grievances by finding common cause with other marginalized groups. Meanwhile, our elitist, anti-elitist culture annoys essentially everyone. We infuriate other elites in our contests against one another. Resentment, distrust, and willful obstruction become the blunt weapons of those left behind outside the elite centers of power and jargony discourses. In particular, older, less well-off, non-credentialed, majority ethnic populations feel estranged from younger, more diverse cohorts who drink strange milks and problematize gender, empire, and throw statues into Bristol Harbor. At present, the electoral numbers are on the side of the elders, such that when the Conservative Party caters to this generation's interests and resentments, we face public withdrawal of public support for higher education, precisely at this pivotal moment. This impoverished higher education is one possible future, perhaps the most likely in the short term. Another possibility involves further differentiation of function, concocted for PowerPoint presentations at the Office for Students, or UUK. These will steer retraining and reskilling for the majority of students while further reinforcing the elitist inequalities at the heart of the system. Though dressed in new lingo around leveling up, such policies would more or less extend the logic of the past 10 to 20 years. Or we can begin articulation of a third possibility I would call civic, whose origins are as deep, if not deeper, than the liberal and social models of education that have produced the contradictory binds we find ourselves in. For at the end of the 19th century, during the transition between universities 1.0 and 2.0, an alternative model and ethic was articulate and institutionalized, particularly in some of the red brick universities, including the Victoria University of Manchester, Liverpool, Leeds, Birmingham, Bristol, and so on. Today, we think of these industrial institutions par excellence, but this is mistaken. Civic universities were more precisely bulwarks against spiritless materialism, bourgeois mediocrity, and the unthinking destruction of our social, environmental, and cultural heritage in the name of so-called progress. A starting point for reconstruction of the civic ethic for the 21st century could be found in Matthew Arnold's criticism of Philistinism. Widely misread as a conservative ideologue, since many of his ideas lend support for otherwise conservative or anti-liberal positions, both in his own time as well as afterwards. A closer reading of Arnold's arguments reveals that his core idea was that culture is for everyone. By extension, he was in favor of universal education. He recommended culture as profoundly useful in getting us unstuck from then-present crises. Quote, "As the great help out of our present difficulties, culture, being a pursuit of our total perfection by means of getting to know, on all the matters which most concern us, the best which has been thought and said in the world, and through this knowledge turning a stream of fresh and free thought upon our stock notions and habits, which we now follow staunchly but mechanically, vainly imagining that there is a virtue in following them staunchly, which makes up for the mischief of following them mechanically." So although Arnold defended traditions and elements of classical beauty and aesthetics that would be lost if the barbarian aristocrats were replaced by the middle-class nonconformist Philistines, he was not particularly conservative, but rather iconoclastic and disruptive of the existing way of doing things. Through genuine access and participation in culture, everyone could learn to cast fresh and creative eyes on existing problems and produce sensible and useful solutions to those problems. For example, in the realm of education, he imagined an expansion of culture emanating from a well-resourced center that could progress knowledge, wisdom, and culture more widely than the narrow yet aimless modern curriculum he found while touring the country as chief inspector of schools. Arnold's faith in culture was due to its ontology insofar as culture, unlike economic wealth, was not consumed when redistributed. Thus, providing access and appreciation to human culture meant everyone could participate equally in the fruits and production of civilization. Culture was not exclusive but empowering, not elitist and useless, but urgent and necessary to tackle societal problems and goals with fresh thinking. As Arnold wrote to his friend Arthur Clough, "The complaining millions of men, darken in labor and pain. What they want is something to animate and ennoble them, not merely to add zest to their melancholy or grace to their dreams." Instead, the ascendant middle classes smashed the idols while reconstructing a lifestyle and culture which aped what they imagined the aristocracy behaved like. They then presented themselves as the patronizing, charitable caretakers of the poor, offering them their education so the dispossessed or poor might one day be capable of self-government and work in their factories. But Arnold asked a different question directed at his own Philistine middle class. On what basis can you pretend to educate others, to self-govern others, when you are so poor at managing yourselves? Maybe the problem is not the uneducated rabble, but rather the inability of the middle classes to manage the powers they have laid claim to. Arnold's concerns provide a different standpoint from which we can begin to rethink the current crisis of higher education. For what if the problems we face are due to our own failures of imagination, our own inadequacies and latent fears that we may well be going about this all wrong? We are widening access to education, and yet, are we certain we are in fact aware of what it is we are widening access to? Surely, we cannot simply leave such questions unanswered or vaguely defined, for in doing so, we confuse rather than enlighten. We mark unnatural distinctions between education for them versus education for us, culture for them, culture for us. Such banal cowardice encourages an expansive mediocrity. As Nietzsche similarly observed in Germany at the time, the expansion and dissemination of education and knowledge goes hand in hand with the narrowing and weakening of knowledge. For various reasons, education is supposed to reach the widest possible circle, such that the demand of the first tendency. But then, the second tendency expects education to give up its own highest, noblest, loftiest aims and content itself with serving some other form of life, for instance, the state. This condition of anti-education was the result of the state's establishment of mass education as the only means through which one could enter the civil service. The demand for universal education necessitated a broadening of the criteria through which teachers were accredited. This group then redefined and narrowed the definition of culture according to their own sensibilities, producing a more mediocre content, which on the one hand diminished the content of a properly classical education, which Nietzsche and Arnold and others admitted no longer existed, even amongst the philologists. On the other hand, the populace became alienated from their own culture and spirit. All were forced into an equally middling, leveled culture, which was not so much the lowest common denominator, but a contentless purgatory in which everyone was equally dissatisfied and unintimidated, if otherwise powerless and slavish. Sounds a bit like neoliberalism to me. Another contemporary of these thinkers, George Eliot, had a similar perspective vis-a-vis the establishment, which she was both adjacent to and excluded from, in part by her sex, but even more substantially by her untraditional family and religious practices and beliefs. This standpoint gave her thought a particular character that informed her realist social philosophy, her unflinching exploration of social relation, ironies, constraints, and pressures for individuals and groups. Eliot depicted the manner in which women, political radicals, religious dissidents, and other marginalized members of Victorian society were treated, how they managed to preserve some glory and honor, even in their seemingly inevitable failures. Society was thus portrayed as realistically highly problematic, and Eliot's genius was to represent these profound everyday injustices in familiar, compelling, and popular forms. Her relationship to education was complex because her writing was generally oriented toward culture writ large, but her influence was significant on educationalists, including Bishop John Percival, founder of Clifton College and the University of Bristol, and others. As with Arnold, Eliot's position was that of a conservative reformer. She could not abide the status quo, but also saw in the present the legacies of past paths not taken. She recognized that much of our current predicament consisted in the liberal tendency to debase the moral currency. As she put it, this is what I call debasing the moral currency, lowering the value of every inspiring fact and tradition so that it will command less and less of the spiritual products, the generous motives which sustain the charm and elevation of our social existence. The something besides bread by which man saves his soul alive. The breadwinner of the family may demand more and more coppery shillings or assignats or greenbacks for his day's work, and so get the needful quantum of food. But let that moral currency be emptied of its value, let a greedy buffoonery debase all historic beauty, majesty, and pathos, and the more you heap up the desecrated symbols, the greater will be the lack of ennobling emotions which subdue the tyranny of suffering and make ambition one with social virtue. Again, we see in Eliot's social philosophy a rejection of the absolutist utilitarian nonconformist position that we must expand culture at all costs, including the cost of genuine culture itself. This is where I see Eliot, Arnold, Nietzsche, and others articulating a non-liberal basis for education that I'm distinguishing by calling civic. Perhaps later social philosophers might call this communitarian, but as I've written elsewhere in a review of Robert Bellet's Sociology, the so-called liberal communitarian debate of the 1980s was largely the construct of liberal pedants, and there's little in the work of Bella, McIntyre, and related scholars that's fundamentally opposed to liberal tenets like individual rights and so on. The claim is that liberalism does not go anywhere near far enough and becomes contradictory, dysfunctional, and ultimately immoral in practice, or amoral. The greatest weakness of liberal, and including the subspecies neoliberal education, is its capacity to disempower individuals and groups demanding change. Liberalism is a kind of 8-bit representation machine where social justice demands for, say, diversity, decolonization, or inclusion are deemed completed once a sufficient number of representative individuals are staged within the relevant photo op. Further consideration of more radical or indeed conservative demands are deemed too divisive and always set aside until some future time that never comes. But as Stephen Lukes and others demonstrate in their analyses of 3 dimensions of power, decision-making, non-decision-making, and ideological power, often those with the most power are those who get to decide what is discussed, what gets platformed, what is considered evidence, what is allowed to be thought versus what can be dismissed as mere theory, what is considered irrelevant because it has no purchase within the existing scholarly literature. In other words, what are the gatekeeping mechanisms that keep the category of knowledge in tiny specialized boxes, minded by experts who are in fact often enough only the last man standing in a long process of attrition? What if there's a far greater percentage of genuine intellectuals who began their degrees in academia, then left, or retired early, or who were bullied out by the more mediocre superiors who saw their refusal to play by the rules as a threat to their mediocre existence? To my mind, these are the questions we need to start asking ourselves. We then need to turn to the question of where can we find these fellows out there in the world? Not simply the future scholars taking A-levels this year or next year, but those adults living happily and successfully with half a PhD. We need to ask them, how can we reform our institutions to no longer crush and grind our brightest stars into dust? Help us to find those adults who found school mindless and dull. Guess what? A lot of it is. In going through such self-reflexive and dialogic discussions with our colleagues, community, students, and alumni, we might begin to see things in as fresh a light as Arnold suggests. We might begin to identify those points where we have allowed the moral currency to have been debased. We might begin the process of reconstructing knowledge for everyone, not simply the 50% of young people who score well enough on a narrow test of rote learning. Not even the 100% of young people who might enter higher education, many of whom don't have a genuine interest in doing so at the age of 18. We must begin to reconceive the civic university as genuinely being for all people. Young, old, middle-aged, academic, non-academic, professional, semi-skilled, able-bodied, minority ethnic, majority ethnic, resident, citizen, refugee, and remote learner. Where do we begin such a process? Again, I would introduce the thinking of another classical civic sociologist of the era, W.E.B. Du Bois. In the early part of his career, Du Bois introduced the notion of the talented tenth, an intellectual elite present in every race, for whom a robust classical education should be organized. These gifted leaders would become the teachers and civic organizers of every community. In due course, this would lift the entire race up. Now, the elitism within Du Bois's position was criticized at the time and since, and Du Bois himself refined, revised, and clarified his initial standpoint in relation to this criticism over his lifetime. I would not therefore uncritically recommend the talented 10th position, just as I'm not suggesting we take on all of Arnold or Eliot's ideas without critical interrogation and reconstruction. But consider Du Bois's educational philosophy in relation to the debates he was involved in. Specifically, his more radical and intellectualist position was opposed to that of Booker T. Washington, who wanted to expand education and skills for the Black community so that they could enter jobs, then in time gradually improve their condition in a context where realistically they would be excluded from further opportunity. This was the South, the American South of the late 19th century. What Du Bois observed was that such skills-based and technical education would only be training blacks to work for someone else. In this way, the Washington or Tuskegee model retained the racial hierarchy even while appearing to improve the condition of blacks in America. In the short run, perhaps Du Bois's elitist position seems more exclusive, but in the long run, such an educational revolution would in due course touch the entire black community in undiluted form. All would be able to consider themselves equals, would have access to the highest fruits of civilization and contribute to those. They would not satisfy themselves with those skills and tasks that external powers that be deemed them eligible for. Ultimately, Du Bois, like many women's suffrage campaigners and others at the time, insisted on a comprehensive and universal humanist vision of equality that could not abide the notion that anyone of any race could or should be excluded from full personhood. This meant full and complete access to culture, with all respective rights to change and mold that culture in one's image, just as white and upper-class elites did without a second thought. The radical democratic position became clearer in Du Bois's later writings as he moved away from the elitist talent and 10th focus on percentages and whatnot, recognizing along with Houston, Woodson, and others that desegregation was at least as important for removing the presence of parallel educational provisions according to race. But we might yet consider the curriculum Du Bois sketched as being necessary for intellectuals to situate themselves and their talents within a wider world, a deeper history, and a more profound moral consciousness. If we make money the object of man training, we shall develop moneymakers, but not necessarily men. If we make technical skill the object of education, we may possess artisans, but not in nature men. Men we shall have only as we make manhood the object of the work of the schools. Intelligence, broad sympathy, knowledge of the world that was and is, and of the relation of men to it. This is the curriculum of that higher education which must underlie true life. Setting aside the use of gender, use of man, manhood, and such like, there's a lot of that in those 19th century texts. It's worth repeating the specific knowledges Du Bois says are required to form, let's call them adults or citizens or simply fellow human beings. Intelligence, broad sympathy, knowledge of the world that was and is, and then the relation of us to it. Are technical skills and information absent from such curriculum? Most certainly not. But these are not the education's aim or telos. Rather, what Victorians in several nations called moral or civic education was the central purpose of both higher learning and common school education. The sociologist Emil Durkheim, for example, wrote about such civil ethics and similarly prescribed a curriculum that would be necessary for individuals to find their own paths within an increasingly complex modern society. If we wish to give our pupils some genuine objective knowledge of what man is really like, and not merely a portrait of how he was ideally conceived at some particular moment of history, we shall have to make him aware not only of what is constant in human nature, but also what element in it is irreducibly diverse. At present, our entire moral and education system is dominated by what Durkheim called the cult of the individual. We must learn to see this as just one of an infinite variety of moral systems in which human beings can self-organize themselves. Indeed, such a pluralistic vision of society is one logical conclusion of liberalism, even if in practice, such a structure as practice precludes the development of genuine content, an integration of a genuine variety or diversity, or indeed a fair and rational distribution of social products and goods. At what point do we stop whinging about neoliberalism and stop to ask ourselves whether it's liberalism writ large, liberalism as such, which may be the infernal source of our never-ending crises in economics, politics, and indeed higher education. What the classical civic thinkers I identified argued, and for anyone familiar with the Victorian era, there are a great many others with similar views: John Ruskin, William Morris, Patrick Geddes, Thorstein Veblen, John Dewey, Emily Davies, Charlotte Gilman, Jane Addams, and on and on and on, who reckoned, I think rightly, that we mustn't concede our morality to the businessmen, the bankers, and their agents. Nor should we accept the organization of peace within the logics of never-ending war. We must fight to establish world peace in our time. We need to imagine what peace looks like, nor can we tolerate the domination and exploitation of Earth and its resources without regard for its inhabitants. We require new ways of doing, new ways of thinking, and not merely at the margins, not merely upgrading our skills for employability across a range of vaguely defined sectors. Further, we must regain the confidence wherein we say to so-called experts and authorities using this kind of language that they're wrong, that it's actually a tragedy that such carriers of mediocre, narrow discourse have made their way into positions of genuine power. And as a civilization, we need to stop the further enculturation of future generations in such inane, shallow, boring, immoral, uninspiring, unimpressive, homogeneous, and archaic forms of education. We must reconstruct knowledge, as Du Bois argued, from the top down, not because we're elitists, but because that is in fact the way the world realistically works. We do no one any favors, least of all those marginalized and disempowered members of our society, by pretending we are these anti-elitist elites who care about all of these social causes and do nothing about them. By doing so, we're handing the keys to the castle to the grifters, charlatans, and bullies. So well done. That's great. Instead, I think the tasks before us are manifold. We must reclaim, reorient, and reconstruct the university in the main. That is, so to speak, the supposedly elite culture exhibited at more or less the wealthiest institutions. At the same time, we must extend this new open and inclusive form of knowledge to 100% of the population. This is how we overcome the inflection point and move on to Universities 3.0, or maybe we can just call it the university. Here's a couple things we might consider doing. 1, everyone needs to be able to access the system where it is most relevant and most accessible, that is, locally. This means removal of barriers due to particular standards and expectations. In particular age, there's no reason why we organize this institution around 18-year-olds. It's arbitrary. 3, bachelor's level education needs to be regeneralized. Specialist training on apprenticeship models are very sensible. But we should have non-knowledge-based occupations working collaboratively with scientific disciplines. There's no reason to separate these specializations from one another. 4, academic work should be public-facing, open, free, and accessible. We should fund the university, and then the university should provide knowledge freely as it's being developed. This means not held exclusively by fee-paying students. Student-teacher relationships would still exist, but they would be replaced by an apprentice-coach model of relation rather than the kind of consumer-producer model. 6, knowledge work should be progressive, processual, and archived, not repetitive and mediocre. So this means new public lectures every year. Those would then become books or articles or whatever. There's no point of reproducing something that's already been said. There's only so many years in our lives. 7, academics should be free to pursue multiple activities, some of which are oriented towards students and teaching, some of which are oriented towards research, some of which are oriented to impact, and these levels might fluctuate. But this doesn't improve by being managed from above and in particular not by being managed externally with external metrics and so on. If more is needed for a particular issue, then that should be negotiated cooperatively and locally. Finally, I argue this should begin immediately. There's no point in waiting for government or economic changes. These are not coming. In any event, our civic educational ideals presuppose empowered agents taking control of their own lives in collaboration with a range of global and local communities. There is no future moment that will be better than the past or present to begin such active participation in life. Indeed, as we find ourselves emerging slowly from an external crisis wherein a tiny, inanimate organism has been enough to make the entire liberal world order come to a screeching halt, wherein we collectively, instinctively, and immediately put the lives and health of others ahead of the demands we contribute to pointless materialism, economic growth, and dysfunctional politics, surely now is the best of all possible times to begin reconstruction. Thank you. That was interesting. Watch myself again.
Extensive use of graphics. I have lots of questions I'd like to ask. I think that's what Zoe's here for. So I will kind of disappear again in the background.
Okay.
Let's carry on.
Thank you. Right. Yes, we had access to this paper in advance. So I've had a few thoughts that I thought Eric and I can have a chat about now together. But I would encourage any of you watching to feel free to add some comments in, be that on Twitter or YouTube as we're chatting, and we can get to those if there's interest there. But yeah, thank you for that paper, Eric. I thought it was really fascinating, and as someone who works at the questioning the relevance of the 19th century in our current predicament, I find it reassuring to hear that there are other methods of responses to that. And I think that I completely agree with you that both Matthew Arnold and George Eliot offer so much, specifically for our current time. I thought that your use of language towards the end of that paper was very interesting in terms of using this language of reconstruction throughout, this idea of a kind of renewal or revival, this idea of taking something and making it new again, I thought was intriguing. And I really like the idea of reconstruction that you used extensively throughout. So I thought I might start with that, talk about this idea of the active work in the university. So I wondered if you might expand a little bit more on a few of those last points, if that's okay.
Sure.
I suppose thinking about that idea of the usefulness of these Victorian thinkers and writers, in particular, I was thinking about that point you made about kind of regeneralization, the idea of kind of PA level education needing to be perhaps regeneralized, this questioning of the current models of specialization being ill-suited perhaps to the needs of all. And I think that there are some echoes there for me in terms of thinking about the histories of education, specifically in Britain around Oxford and Cambridge and their models of liberal education in the 19th century, the idea of the tripos or these kind of multiple strands of knowledge. I just wondered whether for you that is where your thinking about regeneralization comes from. Is it a kind of renewal of that Victorian model, or is it something connected to something else? Can you speak to that and how it connects to this idea of the usefulness of the civic ethics of the past?
Sure. Absolutely, yeah. And so that's a lot of really good questions. I mean, I think Reconstruction is very significant, and it was for lots of thinkers at that. I always call it Edwardian because I mean Edward was relatively short-lived, but as a monarch. But that kind of turn of the century from late 19th into 20th, as opposed to early Victorian, which I think is very different. But in that period, you start to see things like the peace movement really emerging, and you start to see everybody's talking about social reconstruction. And there's a really great book by Chris Rennick, historian at York, talking about the kind of influence of biology and sociology, and I think it started around the 1880s. There was this kind of crisis of economics that everyone realized that utilitarianism was just completely it was just wrong. It was just wrong in every direction. And in part, that was because the utilitarian and the liberals were taking credit for all of these social changes that, it was pretty dubious whether they were actually responsible for it. I think in hindsight, we'd probably say the growth of industrial capitalism in the early 19th century was largely an artifact of the prior investment in slavery and colonialism and those types of things. So to say it was because Adam Smith came up with and Jeremy Bentham came up with the calculus of how to organize individuals for the greatest good. Anyway, they started to use the category of social reconstruction. So I really like that idea, and it carries all the way through, particularly in Britain, all the way through to people like Karl Mannheim when he's in exile and working at Institute of Education. He's writing a book called Man and Society in the Age of Reconstruction. I do need to reiterate, most of these books use like man in big capital letters in this like really awkward way that like makes it really jarring, but they don't mean like men. They mean there's like this concept of man that they are really interested in from a gendered point of view, but still Mannheim is talking about man and society in the Age of Reconstruction. That gets put into post-World War II era. And they're all investing in education for the first time with this ethic. And that's kind of what I want. I don't necessarily want to take all of it on board, but I do just want to think, well, these folks used to think in these ways, and why have we stopped thinking about what are the ends of education? It's surely it can't just be we need skills or whatever. So yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. I suppose following on, I'm going to just pick up on one of the other last 7 manifesto-like claims you made, which I thought were really inspiring, actually. And I think, I'm on board with signing most of those off. So that's great. The idea that knowledge work, it was about a kind of, I guess, anti-mediocre kind of claim you were making. Knowledge work must be progressive, processual, archived, not repetitive, not mediocre. A really inspiring kind of idea, and something that I think that, runs against neoliberal mechanisms of enough, of that minimum expectations of hitting benchmarks, of those kind of measures that we are all subjected to. And I think that, that idea of creating new knowledge forms and pushing at that is something I've been thinking about, certainly during the pandemic, and many of us have kind of returned to new forms of knowledge exchange, be that recording lectures into blank screens in our own houses, or trying out new things like we're doing today, and questioning what it is that we do when we exchange knowledge. And I think there's a serious consideration of the value of the public lecture or the lecture, as a form of knowledge exchange that's coming in the next year, as we kind of begin to emerge out of this particularly isolated environment. And to me, I think that they're vital in performing the work of intellectual exchange. And I think that one of the things I would argue we should take out of the 19th century is the power of a public lecture and space within our civic society for that kind of thinking to happen. But they are a one-way point of delivery, as well as being this kind of substantial performative act. And I guess I was thinking about that in relation to what the effect of that on these more wide societal ambitions that you might have for the university, right? So, Butler writes about the idea that of performative acts having power in the world. The idea that yes, utterance. This is a quote from Butler here. Utterance alone doesn't bring about the day, but it can set into motion a set of actions that under certain felicitous circumstances bring the day around, right? So there's this relationship between speaking about the university or speaking acts of truth about knowledge that perhaps can have an effect. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts on the lecture, the form of the lecture as part of this civic ethics. Is it a form that's outdated? Or is there value in the kind of the occasion of language producing expressions of opinions that come on to gain meaning in their relationship of being spoken aloud?
Sure. Yeah. Well, those are it's another great set of things to think about. There's definitely this kind of popular ed tech kind of boosterist position that says the lecture is dead and there's no evidence that lectures have pedagogical value. And it's sort of like, well, it has survived how many thousands of years, so it probably is doing something. And I think that performative, it's a bit like saying the theater is dead. It's like, sure, cinema came along and changed things around, but there's still theater. It's just like it might need to adapt and do something for the particular role that that other forms cannot reproduce. And I do think there is a lot of scope within the digital learning environment and digital space. I mean, that, as you said, this is something we're trying to do here. As far as I know, there's not a lot of academics who have really tried to explore live streaming, and that's something that we're doing at the academic college, is how can you move things forward? Time is moving forward. So how can you capture that? And hopefully some of that live immediacy when the technology doesn't break does help kind of that the idea of capture, right? So think about lecture capture. Right now, lecture capture is let's position like a weird camera in a corner of a lecture theater with like that sometimes a green light turns on and you get like a really awkward position, and that's supposed to somehow help students to learn, but really it's just used for them when they are, it's an 8:00 lecture and it's like not possible to wake up in time, and then a whole separate category of folks who genuinely need it for learning and accessibility reasons. So it's absolutely essential for those purposes, but for a huge percentage of students, the lecture capture is just like a really mediocre recording of a lecture that if they were there, they'd also potentially fall asleep. I mean, I remember falling asleep in the front row of a lot of my college lectures. So I don't have any problem with the kind of like, let's reduce things to 10 minutes, 15 minutes, or what have you. But I also think that, talking about performativity, part of what we're trying to do here is, for example, the live recording I just did was longer than 15 minutes. It was 35 minutes, but it has a lot of moving, it's edited in a sense. And that's something that perhaps academics can start to be more creative about how you can communicate more information in a concise amount of time. So that lecture, for example, was about 35 minutes, but probably if I was giving it live, it might be about over an hour or something. So I think we can experiment and explore some of these ideas moving forward.
Yeah, sounds good to me. I'll have just maybe one more question, if that's all right. I know that we're coming up to the hour, and I don't want to sort of press you too long on a Wednesday afternoon. I guess I wanted to pick up on the idea of civics, and I think that seems to be a word that contains a lot of potential to me. Maybe because it's this kind of suspiciously neutral word, a word that doesn't, to me, seem to be the property of either elitist or traditional views of HE, or those elitist members of the academy in the 21st century. The word civics seems to me slightly suspiciously neutral, way of conceiving it. But yeah, I guess thinking about where to place them politically kind of ties back to that comment you made about Arnold and Eliot, neither fitting into either camp quite right either, and that kind of positioning of the idea of civics as a politically neutral meeting point between conservatism, liberalism, left-wing progressive politics, whether that seems like something useful to think about.
Yeah, well, I hesitate to preempt, but I'm in the chat. Our special guest may have to leave, and I actually would be interested to know what he has to say about this, because I think that anti-elitist thing versus elitist is one. I mean, the whole book that I wrote, The University Revolution, is like that's the core tension for academics, is because we don't want to be elitist, but yet, why are we getting degrees to say that we are more knowledgeable about certain things? So it might not be a particular shock, but here's Chris. So maybe Chris wants to jump in. So Chris, thank you for joining us this week as well.
Hey, yeah, I didn't think I was a special guest. I thought I was
no.
a cat.
Member of the process. Now we're all
that it wasn't going to be covered by the equity terms here. So. Sorry, I don't like a hug. I thought that was really good. I just want to say a couple of things quickly in response to it. Because you were talking about massification kind of failing in various ways. I think it was sabotaged pretty deliberately, and a really clean example is what happened with the Willits so-called reforms. The Willits funding changes in the early part of the 2010s in the United Kingdom. They very deliberately cut public funding, right, the teaching grant. They very deliberately replaced that with tripled fee cap. They very deliberately created a student debt problem in this country, right? So the average student debt in the United Kingdom for somebody after 3 years of university for graduates is £40,000. Okay, so in other words, the Willits changes did in a few years what it took the United States 30 years to achieve in terms of the student debt crisis, and the total is now of outstanding student debt is about 140 million pounds, and it's heading towards 140 billion, and it's heading towards $500 billion by the middle of the century. So you mentioned the US number, but the UK is smaller, but it's increasing faster, so there's going to be a convergence at some point. Why is this important? Well, it's a huge hardship on students. And it's a hardship on students from disadvantaged backgrounds, students of color, working class students, immigrant students, refugee students, everybody that you wanted to bring in, Eric, quite correctly. So that's problem number one. It's totally unfair that these new entrants are entering with this burden that they're almost entirely white. Preceding generations did not have. That's the first point. Second one is that it's a form of social engineering, very much desired by business. And remember, it was the former CEO of British Petroleum, Brown, who wrote the report in 2010 that produced this Tory change. It's very much a desire to shove everybody towards workplace skilling. And so if you are looking at 40,000 pounds of debt, the only way you can get out of it is by staying low income, right? There's that loophole, which they're trying to close by, again, thinking about lowering the threshold. And HEPI just produced a report. Nick Hillman, who's running that, who used to work for Willis, et cetera, so this lineage is still very much in play, are talking about lowering, shrinking the number of people who be ineligible. But then basically the best way of doing it is to have a high earning job, so you can really pay your debts quickly. The only way to do that is to go into, a corporate kind of position. So you want to be a nurse, you want to be a teacher, you're going to have a much harder time paying loans back. So you should really go into business law, think about intellectual property stuff, go into engineering, go into a certain kind of medical specialty where you can have a private practice. So am I saying it's a conspiracy to destroy non-monetary goals in education, as you very nicely described them, Eric? No, but it's a long-term cultural tendency in Anglo-America to diminish the status of anything that doesn't serve a kind of a human capital focus, and increase the status of anything that is about nose to the grindstone, orient your life around maximizing your skills utility for a maximal income that can then pay, help service your loans. So that has to be addressed, I think, as part of your university's 3.0.
Sure. Yeah, well, I mean, I think I agree with you about the low income versus up, but there was recently a really impressive study done by Charlie Eaton and some colleagues in America who were assessing whether debt relief would be progressive, and the conclusion was that it would be, and the reason is that the wealthiest wealthiest students don't pay anything at all because their parents are paying. And that's actually the same in the UK. And I wrote a piece in The Guardian that a few years ago that talked about the 10% of wealthy students who, when I made the suggestion, I said, well, it should be free for everyone, not just the wealthy students. And then all the commenters, even at The Guardian, were like, well, but the parents paid. The parents paid for, and there's sort of this assumption that children are entitled to that kind of an inheritance of social position, that your parents work hard and then they pass that down, and one of the mechanisms for doing that is universities. So it would be unfair to stop. In the same way, it might be unfair to, say, limit private school or something, or abolish Eton or what have you. That's but I think until you start to address that, the idea of being, I would say, excessively anti-elitists. It's not that being against elitism is a problem, like that inequality is a problem, and to be against your own privilege or to check your privilege or whatever. But there's a point at which it goes so far that you're actually knocking down the profession that is actually a bulwark against these other elites. And that's the point at which I feel like we need to get that sweet spot. Yeah. And just going back to Zoe's idea of like, well, what unites? Why is civics in the middle there? And I think it's that kind of civic Republican, almost like Machiavellian type of like Italian humanist position that you are a full person when you are a political citizen. So whether you're a conservative or a socialist or even a liberal, it's provided you're actively engaged in what you do and in the world around you. But one of the frustrations I have with this neoliberal model that Chris is describing is that actually shuts down that capacity. It almost willfully stops people from becoming engaged and replaces that with, here's your consumer choices. I mean, at that point, I become almost like a Marcuse. It's one-dimensional society at that point. You can choose this, this university or that university. You get a degree. It doesn't actually matter what it is about, but here it is, and also doesn't have particularly any advantage on even the job market that you're supposedly getting skilled up for. Yeah, because everyone's going into law and business. It's like everybody's going into the same fields. It doesn't make any sense.
It's totally crazy. Eric, can I say one more thing? I have to jump off to a meeting I'm late for. I'm really sorry.
Oh yeah.
The ship in the extreme, but then others, the extension of this thing about debt-free university, which I think is really important, that would embellish this, the civic university. Embellish it would be like the whole thing is intellectuality. So, I mean, that's the thing that really strikes me about the, students of color. So, people that are coming from groups that were underrepresented before and are less underrepresented now, although still underrepresented. And that is the desire not to be shunted onto the vocational track.
Exactly.
That idea that, studying art history, and the Italian masters, that's for rich people who can pay for it out of pocket. You working class people, if you want the taxpayer to pay, you have to study the coding equivalent of auto mechanics. Whether, even if your aptitude and your passion and your interest is for the Italian masters.
Well, it's like getting rid of media studies. That's, Mickey Mouse degrees or whatever.
That's also crazy because that's England's last great export is media. So that is just, from the pure capitalist point of view, really dumb. They're not even good capitalists, but they're especially not good at understanding the educational desire of the full population that you're talking about. Right. So I can't remember if I mentioned this last time, but my last what we call senior seminars in the U.S., they're final year students, and they get one class with 15 in the University of California in their 4 years there. It was majority Latina. There's 15 students. 8 or 9 of them spoke Spanish as a first language. They're very multilingual. People were speaking Russian and Persian and other home languages, in Southern California. And they did not want to get a BA degree so that they could manage a store. They wanted to get a BA degree in English so that they could use literature, cultural analysis, screenwriting skills, journalism, some mixture that hasn't been invented yet, to transform their communities and their societies and their family lives and their gender relations and the whole, race relations, everything. I mean, they were incredibly engaged in the intellectual formations that enable, democratic empowerment in the most basic sense. And so it's not, people look at the university and say, oh, you're just doing politically correct politics. It's no, we're doing the intellectual groundwork for independent thought, which is supposed to be what people in democratic societies want everybody to have, not just the people that go to Oxbridge.
Yeah. Absolutely. If I can just jump in quickly there. No, I know you might have to leave, Chris. No worries if you do. But just that idea of work not having to be something without meaning. There's been some interesting studies this week published by HESA on trying to use graduate outcome data, right, to see what students have to say about meaningful work. And I think that kind of question about what questions we ask of students when they finish their degrees in this kind of metricization, as much as I'm kind of critical of that, the actual questions we ask are fundamental, and maybe analyzing some of that data. I think the HESA studies looking at this kind of parts of it, which says things like my current work is meaningful. I'm using what I studied in my current work. These are interesting questions to kind of unpack and really kind of push for, I think, in terms of a national policy level. So I just wanted to flag up that report which came out last week. I thought it was interesting. So.
Yeah.
Well, and I think Zoe, your work on valuing the humanities. I mean, I suppose it's. I'm looking forward to your talk, which is now, I suppose, in more than 2 weeks. It might be a few weeks from now, towards August, I think. But I mean, the humanities seems to be the real field that's suffering under this regime, and I don't think that's a coincidence. I think it's because the humanities actually can provide these types of this complexity. How would you see the humanities playing into that?
I mean, I think absolutely. I'll speak more about this in August as promised, but I think that, the role of the humanities within national higher education policy, specifically in the UK, has been a fraught one for 10 years, and it's not a surprise that we've seen a decline in student numbers based on the kind of narratives of value that we hear time and time again from the government and circulated then in the media. So I don't want to give an answer now. I'll give a proper answer.
No, with preview. And I don't know if Chris, if you have to run, that's also
well.
fine.
I'll just say one last thing. Humanities, they're the fields that foreground the place of the self in social relations. So, I mean, the reason I got into it, I was studying biology and physics until my last year, and I ended up taking an extra year to shift into philosophy and literature. And the reason was that, in contrast to those science fields, one's inner life, which of course was a great fascination to me at the time, the torment of it all, is present in social relations. So identity, your gender, your race, your position, your socioeconomic status, your national origin, all these things are directly connected to knowledge formation and then to the power of action in the world. And they're very foregrounded. They're not kind of on the side, can I use environmental science to... It's like it's right there. It's so your cognition as identity and subject matter are fused. And actually cognitive science is showing that people learn best when their identities are allowed into the picture in the first place. So in a better if we had a better understanding of education, the humanities would be there with everything else. We're not talking about throwing anything out, but it would be co-equal in a way that it's not now, as it's being subordinated as fluffy or as optional as for rich kids, which it absolutely
right.
Sorry to leave.
Well, thank you.
That's pretty.
No, I'm sure, and I'm sure we'll see you again in the later next stage of the process.
Great talk, you all.
Thank you.
Right.
Thanks, Chris. And I'm sorry. I may have. I hope I got to your questions earlier, but I think that the question of the elitism is a really interesting one to get into. I saw Carl had a comment as well that related. I don't know if we want to widen out.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it takes us back to an older thread, but there's I don't have a word for word, but there's a moment where you talk about the full and complete access to culture and the ability to hold that culture. Who has access to that? And perhaps this has a different resonance today, particularly in the context of social media, where people are creating a sense of culture, but to my reading of it, it doesn't really. Well, I guess the question would be, how does that engage with? Does that inform academia or academic constructs as opposed to?
Yeah. Well, and I don't know. I that's a really good question. I almost feel like Zoe also. I don't know if you have any thoughts on this, but I don't personally feel like academia today is structured around being open, in the sense of like part of the issue with the fee-paying students. It's just kind of like, okay, it's consumer relation. That's a narrowing of knowledge or what have you. But there's something that really bothers me about the idea that there's this intellectual work that's being produced by academics, by students themselves, and that's like proprietarily held in some way by the university, like a specific university. I just don't think that's, I don't think that that's the original idea of the university. I don't think that that's what it's intended. It's not intended that we produce these lectures and then sell them year after year to as many people as we can. And don't provide it to anyone who didn't pay.
It's a really interesting debate, and just to come in now, I think that I completely agree with you, Eric, about how the conditions of this kind of privatization, these forces of kind of, I guess, a competitiveness over the ownership of certain types of intellectual property that happens between universities, certainly I think is a symptom of the sheer value of that to individual consumers. If we're talking about Britain, we're talking about the way in which the language of higher education policy does conceive students as consumers, right? But there are some interesting things I've been looking at for a more optimistic alternative to end on. I've recently I've been engaging in kind of the field of the public humanities, and I don't know if this is something you're aware of or not, but there's an interesting move specifically in the United States. So it's a shame Chris is left. He could probably speak to this more, but a kind of sense that there is work also happening in universities that is more interested in this kind of co-creative forms of knowledge that's based around addressing challenges that are perhaps exclusively suited to the university to solve, and a recognition of external expertise is something I've been really interested in developing. There's a class I taught last semester and I will be teaching again next year at Birmingham, which is about public English, which asks students to think about the role of kind of the subject of English in intersection with other parts of society. And I think to me, that kind of work does great value to not kind of giving into this isomorphic way of thinking where we allow everything to become one another. We all become experts in policy, we all become experts in the economy, but rather we kind of recognize what the study and scholarship of the humanities brings, but also the things that we need from others, people in other professions, but also people within communities, and that kind of sense of knowledge not being this thing that is made in the university and is shipped out. The model that perhaps the first iteration of the REF in the UK really sought to kind of, frame things in that convenient way that we produce products, commercial goods that can be then taken away. No, I think that this kind of work in the public humanities certainly tries to recognize that processual value, that value of exchange, of working together. So I think I would just answer that question, I suppose, by flagging certain emergent ways of working that aren't perhaps validated or recognized across the board, but certainly hold promise for that kind of question, I suppose, of the civic ethics, the relationship of universities to the places that they're located in. Certainly something I'm interested in.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, Chris was talking about kind of the limits of the kind of vocational track. And I think that that's unfortunate that in the U.S., vocational refers to sort of like associate's degrees, kind of like maybe nursing or something that has like a very clear technical set of knowledge, and you just need a certain set of accreditation and then you could start. And so it's very often contrasted against the academic, which is more kind of like liberal arts, general humanist. But actually, I think that there's a lot of space for us to start to rethink what vocational learning is. I mean, there used to be the science as a vocation, politics as a vocation in Max Weber's work. That's the German word is Beruf, which has a lot of different overlapping meanings that I think are really fascinating, which is like office, which we aren't using our home office at the moment. But then there's also calling, so being called to a profession, and then the profession itself. And it's sort of that way of thinking of, each of us are sort of like in some way born into something to do some type of work, and it's up to us to figure out what that is in relation to what social needs are and what opportunities there are. And if you send people into particular vocations based off of what you need them to do, that's actually removing their agency in quite a substantial way. And I'm actually be interested in what Carl thinks, because I know that a lot of your work in architecture is kind of about architecture as a process of learning, not just to make a building, for example.
I think that one of the interesting things about studying architecture, and I think it's in somewhat a little bit more particular in the UK because of the way in which it's divided into three parts. But studying architecture gives you a skill set with which you can then design buildings, but you don't have to design buildings with them. And I think that for me personally, kind of designing and building buildings is much lower on my list of interests than other things. And I think that particularly the part one, the degree, the 3 years or 4 years, I think if you're in Scotland, it really gets you to think a certain way about producing spaces. And of course, that skill set is applicable to, if you like, the construction industry, but it's also applicable to other industries. And I'm personally quite interested, partly because I'm doing that myself, in architects working, or people who are trained as architects, even if it's just a degree level, working in other fields, because I think their skill set is transferable. But it does very much come back to this idea of vocational skill sets. And I think it's very much within the training of the field itself.
Yeah, and hopefully, I mean, now we've got the three of us, the academic college crew, I suppose. And I mean, I think that's part of the idea behind the academic college is this kind of public facing, fully kind of embedded with communities and developing our specialism and being, I don't know, for lack of a better word, like proud, I guess, of like having studied and being, technically proficient in what we do. You don't want an architect who doesn't know what they're doing, like designing your building. Like That's why you go to learn about how to do that. And for whatever reason, with humanities subjects, it's kind of like, well, yeah, I know how to read a book. I know how to speak English. So why do I need to know about how to understand language? And it's like, well, if you understood how claims were being made, then you might, be better at politics or be better at deciphering what laws are affecting you and so on. So hopefully this can be a space to develop that. And I don't mean to preempt, because I'm so grateful to Carl for covering for Zoe in hosting, and then I'm so grateful as well to Zoe for commenting on my paper. So this was a very particular situation, but if I might just kind of explain where we're going next, because we were originally planning to do this fortnightly. Last week that was thwarted by a one-off technical glitch that I don't think will happen again. That was specific to me being the host as well as the discussant or whatever. But what we'll do is we're going to take a pause for 2 months, and then we're going to come back full throttle with Zoe's paper. And I believe that you've already discussed with Mark Kerrigan at Post Pandemic University. And there's a blog post we can link to afterwards that has all of these details. But we're essentially going to line up a fortnightly schedule now that we have a few examples. So we're really grateful to everyone for watching, and really grateful to both of you for, we made ourselves the guinea pigs, because it is really an experiment, and I think it's going okay. Our second try, we've made it happen.
It's the Unitopia process. So.
Absolutely. And if you're watching this and feeling inspired, or that you have something to add to this conversation, do visit academiccollege.org, and there's a contact us form on there. So we'd be really keen to hear from you. That was slick. Well done. I'm continually impressed by production values on the show. So I'm sorry.
We're getting there.
But I'm really looking forward to my paper in August. School's out for the summer, as it were, but we'll reconvene then, and look forward.
Well, thanks everyone.
Thanks. See you guys soon. My hand is in.